in a place and at a time we absolutely did not expect. Particularly interesting rock engravings and paintings have been found, featuring zoomorphic representations of animals with these hands placed, impressed in negative, all things we know from European sites. The story we have all read in textbooks is that in Europe, around 40,000 years ago, the last populations to leave Africa, Homo sapiens, the so-called Cro-Magnon population, arrived in Europe or developed in Europe, it was said, rock art. This exceptional contribution to this wonderful story of the evolution of symbolic intelligence, the ability of our ancestors to produce, to express behaviors not strictly related to reproduction and survival, but to something else, that is, to produce objects that have symbolic value, that refer to something else, that are signs of something, that point to a much richer relational life within these groups. These are art, this rock art. You see that it comes from a completely different part of the world, from the island of Sulawesi. So we are in the Far East, the Indo-Malay archipelago, with a dating that approaches 40,000 years. So, at the same time, we observe the first masterpieces, shortly after, of Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira in Europe. On the other side, thousands and thousands of kilometers away, other humans, whom we still know little about, we do not really know who they were, do the same. We did not expect to find them in that place, and we did not expect to find them so ancient in that place. We expected to find them much more recently. The fact of finding them in the wrong time, that is, when we did not expect and in the wrong place, changes the perspective. And a discovery of this kind, just this alone, even without going into technical details, is a generator of stories. Because we discover that we did not know many things, and new questions arise. Who were these people? What were these Homo sapiens doing there in Sulawesi at such an ancient date? How did they end up there? What path did they develop? Where did they come from? And above all, what is the relationship between those who create these wonderful works in Sulawesi and those who create them in Lascaux or in Cantabria, in Spain, in France? What is the relationship? Where do they originate from? So, for example, there are two hypotheses today that are being considered. One is that they are two completely independent stories, meaning that those who create them in Europe and those who create them here develop them in parallel, and thus it has essentially been a sort of convergent evolution in parallel. Someone else, on the other hand, thinks that there is a connection, a thread between these two stories, and that those who create these wonderful works of art here in the Far East and those who create them in France are actually two branches. Two extreme branches of a single African population that had already begun to do these things, that is, that had already started to develop these behaviors. Two different hypotheses. But these are two stories. They are two historical models. They are two stories that you can compare, that you can share with the kids, that you can discuss with the kids. And they come from a recent discovery that changes the textbooks. Because we will probably no longer be able to say in the future that Paleolithic art definitely started in Europe and not in other parts, and only later in other parts of the world. This second discovery is even more interesting because it also changes many perspectives. Here we are, even more recent. This was published at the beginning of December 2014, so it came out just over a month ago. We are still in that area. Here we are on the island of Java, a little further south in the Solo River Valley, where there are extremely interesting and important sites of Homo erectus habitation, thus the Asian branch of the genus Homo. And in this valley, we know a lot. We have a lot of information about the habitation of these human beings of the genus Homo from the ancient part of the genus Homo. And what is discovered? This is an international team that includes Francesco Del Rico. We discussed it in preview back in mid-October at an international conference. The paper had not yet been published. What is discovered? It is discovered that at one site among these, which is the site of Trinil, to make it brief, a population of Homo erectus, thus a non-sapient species, therefore an older species than ours, and also here from a completely different place compared to both Africa and Europe, at Trinil, these Homo erectus had learned to do some particular things. They had learned to handle certain specific objects by performing 3 types of operations on these objects. These are freshwater shells that they used as food in this valley. On these bivalves, they perform 3 types of operations. They learn to open them in a very ingenious way, using a sharp tool that allows them to open the 2 shells very precisely without breaking them, thus keeping their shape intact. Then what do? They learn not to chip, but rather to file, to thin out. You see, the underside, so they make it very sharp, and thus they open them without breaking them, and then they feed on the contents of the animal. Then they use this file to use them as knives, as blades. First, there is the operation related to feeding, but then there is a second order operation, which is to transform this object into something else, into another tool, moreover. But then a third thing happens. That is, they also make fairly regular designs on the surface, zigzag patterns, which you then see represented in 2 quite interesting repeating patterns. A repetition, then lines in one direction that overlap with lines in another direction. These are intentional repeated marks with a reference pattern. And according to the interpretations of these scholars, they can be attributed to a symbolic activity. That is, for these populations of Homo erectus, these objects could be interpreted as objects with a symbolic value. Perhaps those drawings, those regularities, those engraved shapes here want to convey something. Now, what is the problem? That, for the first time ever, the possible presence of symbolic behavior is observed in a species that is not Homo sapiens, and it challenges, would challenge, perhaps will challenge, the discussion opens, the dogma that only Homo sapiens has been capable of developing symbolic intelligence, and it challenges the temporal dogma because until today, the object on which symbolic signs were found was dated to 75,000 years ago, which is the Blombos plaque found in South Africa $75,000 years ago. These engravings date from 430,000 to 540,000 years. It is an incredible backward breakthrough, which was absolutely unimaginable until a few months ago. If this discovery were to be confirmed, we need to reconsider a whole series of models. We need to rediscuss a series of models that we had taken for granted and that we find in all school textbooks. That we find as a reference in all school textbooks. I feel a sense of dismay creeping in because it is exhausting to have to start over every time, to question things that we took for granted. Even here, however, regardless of how the story will end, a discovery like this is a generator of stories because it raises many questions. Who were these people? Because all the other Homo erectus we have found so far do not exhibit this behavior because it is right there. And why do those who come after them no longer exhibit it? What happened? What is it? Did they learn to do it, then unlearn it? Hard to imagine. Did they learn to do it, then go extinct? Possible. Or did they learn to do it, then were replaced by others who did not know how to do it? Anything could have happened. All of these are hypotheses. It is possible, but they are new questions. In that area, by the way, not far away, on an island nearby, on the island of Flores, lived another human species, which is Homo floresiensis, who does not seem to have exhibited behaviors of this kind at all, as far as we know today. So it is a complicated story, a very interesting story, that generates stories, once again, and I point out a detail. These stories arise from how we place them in time and space. I would like to focus your attention on these 2 coordinates, time and space. So far, we have mainly told the story of evolution using the temporal axis, and that is obvious. I am not saying it is wrong. It is obvious. What is evolution? It is a change over time, a morphological and behavioral transformation over time. And so obviously we tell the story of evolution through genealogy, kinship, the tree of descent, the change over time. Very well, all correct. However, we have forgotten the B side of evolution, which is at least equally important. That is, evolution is a process, a story that occurs in space, that occurs in geographical space, in physical space. There are physical populations immersed in a physical environment, in an ecology, in an unstable climate, that move, that learn to do things, that pass them on to others. In short, it is a physical story that takes place in geographical space. This is the other great axis of evolutionary explanation, which is very effective didactically and has so far been used very little. In the Homo sapiens exhibition, which we did with Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, our challenge was precisely to try, for the first time at least for us, to tell the story of evolution using, instead of phylogenetic schemes, trees, only maps, and just maps, geographical maps. Can evolution be told using only maps? Yes, it can be done if you explain that behind that map there is a story of movements, of populating, of migrations, of isolations, of sedimentations, of hybridizations, all fundamental words in evolution. So, these are two examples of discoveries from the last weeks, the last months, which, and this is also the exercise we do. For example, in Padua with my students, the exercise in the lessons we conduct. It's always this: you always start from a paper of today, of now, an open question, a new discovery, not settled things, but new things that have emerged immediately. These generate questions, are interpreted, are compared with others, with the background knowledge we had before, and it is indeed a truly procedural way of telling science and seeing how it works. Seeing how it works, because then obviously this paper has already been commented on. There are some who disagree, who will write a paper with a different hypothesis, so a controversy will arise and the students learn to understand what a scientific controversy means. For example, having an idea is a different idea, arguing them, opposing evidence where everyone has a say as long as they have their own, the wave and the proof. That is, having good evidence, good arguments. And this, allow me to say, in this historical period, sharing with students a way of thinking where a truth with a capital T does not emerge, but a provisional consensus emerges through the confrontation of alternative hypotheses, through the commitment to argue one's own reasons, to explain one's own reasons publicly in front of others, to defend them, to accept the criticism of others, is perhaps one of the most important educational meanings overall of science, and that is what science gives to the active citizenship of these students when they leave school. So, all this, as I told you before, clashes with risks, with dangers, because as Darwin said, we like stories that have a happy ending. And in fact, if we look at how it is represented at a divulgative level in the detrimental sense of the term, that is, go on Google tonight, put in the part where you search for images and click human evolution, you will find tens of thousands of identical images. These human evolution in popular imagination, in the great anarchic stage of the web where our students dive in, without knowing well, often without asking themselves who is speaking to me, that is, who is the source, the origin, who is telling me these things, why is he telling me, and what qualifications does this person have who is telling me these things? The students do this, human evolution, you click, and you always find these. You are the ones up there in the top right who came to hear a story of human evolution. Then you find them narrated. In an ironic way, they are used in advertisements. This is one of the great icons of our time. It has had great success and continues to have it. There are all kinds. My absolute favorite is this one, because this is the one that appeared in The Simpsons, drawn by Matt Groening, who is a genius and often incorporates science into his stories because he is very passionate about it and knows it well. So to poke fun at this ever-resurgent image of human evolution as a great chain of progress, he rightly interprets in this whole story as a great march of progress towards Homo sapiens instead of Homo sapiens. There is a great paleontologist, but from the past, unfortunately he died young in 2002, Stephen Jay Gould. He always showed these images. He always said to look at them closely because this, and he said it more than 10 years ago, but it is still true today. This is our great iconography of hope, he said. And it is a way of telling stories. This is a story we like. This is a success story. It is a comforting story. It is a very clear story. It is easily understood. So few clear and wrong ideas, okay? Few clear and wrong ideas that work, that resonate. It doesn't take much to teach this because we like it. We like the idea that human evolution has been a story in which those who come after replace those who came before. Well, we really like this idea because it means that those who came after were better than those who came before. They were smarter, they were more adapted, they were more flexible, everything you want, but above all, because those who came after were more human and those who came after resemble us more, because this is what we like about this story. What do we like? That it is a story with a single track whose outcome is what? Us. So it is the idea that the present, we here today, undisputed rulers of this planet, have become 7.4 billion. We are many. We are the necessary outcome of this story. So, history becomes a justification of the present. It says that this present we live today was the only necessary one, it was the right one, and that we are the culmination of a great, glorious march of progress. This is a story that works very well, and it is a story, so you see that this is a story. It is a story. It is a way of telling a story. It is an epic story. In the past, there was even someone who did a very nice exercise, a biologist, a paleoanthropologist, but also an expert in literature, who used the stylistic elements of storytelling, those of the morphology, of the fairy tale by Prop, for example, the structuralist interpretation on paleoanthropology texts, discovering that they all contain the stylistic element, the structure of the hero's tale. The hero, right. Someone who begins, the protagonist who starts a story, no one would bet 2 cents on him, but then he starts to overcome challenges. The initiation rite becomes stronger and stronger. He makes it. It almost seems that at a certain point he won't make it, but then he does and triumphs and wins over everyone else. The hero. Here, the hero's tale is present with all the narrative stylistic elements in many stories from the past of human evolution. So, why am I giving you this example? Because this is a happy ending story. As Darwin said, we really like these stories because we have a teleological mind. This is very important to keep in mind. We have an intuitive approach to history and storytelling that makes us prefer at first glance, precisely intuitively, a story that has a narrative watermark of a teleological type, that is, where there is a final cause, where there is a necessity that develops. That is, notice how a story in which, all in all, everything was already written at the beginning, because it is a destiny that unfolds, is all written at the start, and then the story does nothing but unravel, developing this watermark that was there from the beginning until it is fulfilled at the end. So everything was already written at the beginning, and the story is like a scroll that unfolds. Evolution's etymology is from unrolling a papyrus, evolve, evolution comes from this. I evolve does not mean I originally changed in the 19th century, but it meant to unroll a papyrus. And unrolling a papyrus, unrolling a scroll with a story inside, is exactly this idea. Everything is written at the beginning. I just have to open, unravel, unfold, and evolve this story. And Darwin, who was a very refined person from this point of view, he understood this thing. He always said the word evolution. I don't like it all. It's paradoxical because we all know him as the father of the theory of evolution. But if you go to look at the origin of species, he never uses the word evolution. Have you ever noticed? Never. He only uses it as a verb 2 lines from the end. It's the only point in the origin of species where he uses the verb evolve. 2 lines from the end, he says these infinite, beautiful, and wonderful forms. It is astonishing and grand to think how, from such a simple beginning, they were able to evolve. The only point where he says it. Why does he carefully avoid the word evolution? Because at his time, the word evolution had this teleological connotation. It had this connotation of a scroll that unfolds. And he repeats it in his letters. He says, evolution, that is, what I consider transformation, is not a scroll that unfolds, absolutely. It is not all written at the beginning. It is a story in which events follow one another, and the story unfolds in the process. It is not all already written at the beginning. The meaning of the story emerges within the story as the story unfolds. And therefore, it is a contingent story that can go in different directions because it is not a story of necessity. So evolution, which at that time meant development, what we today call development, that is individual development, individual growth, was a word he wanted to avoid carefully. He would have preferred to be remembered as the father of the theory of transmutation. That was the word he had chosen. And transmutation, you see, is a much more neutral word. It tells a story of change. It almost seems like metamorphosis, a form that changes, a transformation, transmutation. Then we know that the history of science goes a bit on its own, and one may not like a word, but if everyone else uses it. In the end, Darwin, shortly after he died, was already remembered by everyone as the father of the theory of evolution. It went that way, but he would not have wanted it that way. It was a word he did not love at all and never used. It tells us something profound, however, that he understood what. And here I come to the point on which I will then tell you a couple more things, and then I will leave the floor to you, as I care a lot that there is also an exchange, a debate altogether. He realizes this. If we get to the heart of it, and it is perhaps the most difficult thing, but also perhaps the most important, that I would like to share with you. There are some types of stories, I'll keep it simple. There are certain stories that we like, that are intuitive, but what is the problem with Darwinian evolution? It is that it is a type of story that is instead counterintuitive, that is, it contradicts these easy stories. So, by itself, the evolutionary explanation is not easy. It is a counterintuitive explanation. It is a disorienting explanation. Just as science itself is fundamentally counterintuitive and disorienting, I am glad that when I showed you those two images, you had a moment of discouragement. We need to start rewriting. That's how it is. This is exactly how science works. A condition of permanent bewilderment, a condition of precariousness. So you can never be sure once and for all that a model will work indefinitely, is built on stilts, Karl Popper said. Science is not built on concrete. It is better to build it on stilts, more flexible because you can move it, deconstruct it, and reconstruct it. So, this is the difficulty but also the charm of science. This process of continuous self-review, of continuous self-correction. So the big question, in short, is educational. If science is this thing, when we teach it to kids, especially young children, I insist, it is early scientific education. My obsession, we cannot betray it. If science is this thing, we cannot then teach it as if it were a catalog of preconceived ideas, because by doing so, perhaps we take a shortcut and everything is faster. But even at the cost of teaching less, I think it is much more important to show that science is this fantastic, unique human endeavor of conquering knowledge, constantly subject to revision, transformation, a process of continuous review and constant questioning of our assumptions, because there are not many forms of thought that have these characteristics. Other forms of thought, yes, some do, those serious, rigorous ones, but there are other forms of thought that prefer to tell us that things are this way, period. Science, on the other hand, is a continuous attempt to question even its own assumptions. And this can be taught, in my opinion, even if it is counterintuitive. There are ways in which it can be taught, and that is the last part I want to discuss with you. How do we overcome these resistances? How do we question this persuasive image that we like so much? How do we dismantle it? In my opinion, it can be done by telling a different story, that is, not giving up on the story, but trying to share with the kids an alternative story, which coincidentally reflects the empirical data much more. And we return to the theme of always staying on the frontier of research. The first oddity, for example, that can be highlighted and is very effective is this. That boy I was talking about at the beginning, when he returns from his trip and writes those notebooks I mentioned earlier at a certain point in July 1937, so he is not yet 30, he is 28. I always tell my students that they are almost contemporaries. It won't be long before they wake up, because scientific revolutions were already made by people before they even graduated. At 28, he created this drawing, the famous Tree of Life, which we all know, the Tree of Life, the branching of life, this idea. Beautiful. That all living beings, without exception, down to the last bacterium, the last fungus, are all related to each other. They are all connected by a single network, Darwin said, wrote in the notebooks, they are all linked by a relationship of kinship, of cousinship. So, within a framework like this, there is a scientific revolution, of course. There are a lot of important ideas. There is the common ancestor, common descent, speciation, extinction. Not all stories end well, Darwin said at the beginning, right? There is extinction, another important theme to discuss. Why does it happen that branches are interrupted, that they are removed? Because there is extinction, which is the flip side of evolution, because it creates ecological space for new diversifications, for new species. So everything is included in this framework. But the beautiful thing that works, I do it, I know. I did it in a Montessori school last month with the kids. I showed them the linear diagram, and then I showed them the tree. And then we started discussing for 3/4 of an hour to see what the differences are between the two, and they bring them all out. This diagram here is incompatible with the previous one, because here there are always many species all together. There are grandparents and cousins. There isn't one that comes after and eliminates all those that were there before, right? It is not a linear story. This is a story of branching. Here I can make comparisons between species. Current extinct species can do a whole series of things, and this is an alternative story to the previous one. Incompatible. You cannot put them together. You either have that linear vision from before or this tree-like branching vision. So, if this opposition is clear, then a whole series of other exercises can be done. Here it's a bit bold because I show the Montessori kids the papers from science. And one says, "Goodness, are you out of your mind?" Because the science paper is something for hyper-specialists. But no, because it's enough to look at this. It was published in Science in 2010, and it's a phylogeny of hominids and anthropoid apes that today includes everyone, at least up to the pongids, at least the orangutans. And here too, you perceive that there is a flow of time, in this case from left to right. This is a story that covers about 30 million years. It's a story of grandparents and cousins, because they are common ancestors that then gave rise to diversifications. And those we see today as our closest cousins, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and then moving further, gibbons and siamang, are all first, second, nth degree cousins because you just need to go back with these branches, and at a certain point, you find a point that is the union of these branches. That is the point where their grandfather lived. Grandfather cousin is a very simple scheme from a narrative point of view, and it is a correct scheme because you ask what you have in common with your first cousin, a grandfather, with your second cousin, a great-grandfather, the third, the fourth. The more you add, the further back in time you go, right? And this is a very simple scheme of a branching phylogeny. Then you take Homo. We are there. It's another very simple exercise that can be done here. You take a pencil, and you let the kids choose any point in time. They choose, I don't know, let's take the time machine. Let's go back 10 million years. Take the pencil, draw a line from 10 forward, which means it's like taking a photograph of what was there 10 million years ago, as if an extraterrestrial scientist landed on Earth and started observing the world of primates, of anthropoid apes, 10 million years ago. And then you have them count how many there are, and they realize that, I don't know, 10 million years ago, as far as we know today, there were at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13 of these branches, which already intuitively disproves the previous image. It is not true that evolution proceeds through a single species that replaces the others, but at every moment of evolution, there is a plurality of forms, there is a plurality of stories. That branch out, this branching evolution of stories that fork, that ramify, then the exercise can continue. You have them remove all the other branches, so they forget about all the other cousins, and you have them focus like a sort of zoom, like a sort of zooming in. You have them focus only on a piece of this story. And here a scheme of this kind that may seem very difficult is actually not, because it is enough to see it as a set of clues. Here time flows from bottom to top, so the scheme has the past below and the present today. The present is up there. It is 2015. Here we have left out all the others. We have left out the common ancestor with the chimpanzee moving forward. So we zoom in. These are no longer genera but species. And here you see how, since we separated from the common ancestor with chimpanzees about 6 million years ago to today in 2015, Probably more than 20 different species have lived, belonging to the most diverse genera. The Australopithecines, these are the ones we all studied in school. Then there are the Paranthropines, then there are the Ardipithecines, then there are the Kenyapithecines, and then there are many other stories. And at a certain point, there are the species you see in violet blue. Those are the species of the genus Homo. And you go on like this and illustrate this story of diversification, which culminates in what this is just the last thing I want to share with you. Culminates in what, in a last little branch, they are lost up to the right, which is us. And this is very effective. I remember I have done it several times with the kids. I have done it even with my children who attended school in various classes. And this is something they remember, that we are not at the top of a ladder, but we are that little branch there. And this insight is already very important because it generates stories, because if this message has been conveyed, then you can, for example, do a very simple exercise that is the same as before. Start from 2015 today, go back nothing, go back 50,000 years, which is practically a layer that is hardly visible, which is another difficulty, obviously the perception of time. But with the kids, they are small, but 50,000 years is a geological layer, a little more. It is a unit of time, a blink of an eye, an evolution, we could say. Just go back so little. Draw that famous pencil line, and what do you find? Erectus in Asia, Floresiensis, Neanderthal, Denisova man, and Homo sapiens. That is, you intuitively discover that up to 50, 100,000 years ago, 4 or 5 human forms coexisted on this planet. And so you make the discovery, which is indeed disorienting. It has also been disorienting for scientists because they didn't believe it until a few years ago, that we Homo sapiens have been alone on this planet for a very short time, and that just going back a bit you find our cousins still surviving, still living. You find Neanderthal man in Europe until about 30,000 years ago, or probably a little less. You find Flores man in Indonesia until even 12, perhaps 15,000 years ago. That is a being, human, of the genus Homo, that has survived almost to the threshold of history, something incredible, almost inconceivable for us. The message here intuitively that can come across is, look, until just yesterday we were not alone. Look, until just yesterday there were other human beings. Americans who are always exaggerated. I recently heard colleagues who want to propose for the expression differently sapiens, which frankly seems a bit exaggerated to me. And among other things, we could discuss this proposal in class. That is, why philosophically, why do we have to define others as different from us? Implicitly, we are saying that we are the model and others are different from us, right? Nothing would exclude then defining ourselves as differently Neanderthal, for example, right? Because we are differently Neanderthal, for example, but we don't like this thing that we are defined as differently Neanderthal won't pass. So, among other things, I open a parenthesis. You see that these stories are very interesting hooks to open many other windows, right? On the place of man in nature, on how we conceive ourselves in relation to ourselves, in relation to nature. Another question that the children always ask me every time I reach this point in the story. Immediately there's a child who raises their hand and says, "But where have all the other 4 gone? Why are they not here yet?" And this is a great question because it is a question that scientists do not know how to answer. It is an excellent scientific question. The answer is, we don't know why the others are not here yet. We have some suspicions, of course. We have suspicions about ourselves that we might have had a hand in the end of all the others, but we don't have solid data on this yet because we discover that sapiens and Neanderthals, for example, coexisted in certain territories for a fairly long period. So it means that there were conditions for these populations to coexist at least for a certain time. Some even think this is a high-level scientific debate, very, very beautiful, very important, interesting, especially intriguing from middle school onwards, that there could have been close encounters of a prehistoric kind, as someone called them, meaning that a sapiens and a Neanderthal could have mated, that they could have made love, producing a hybrid offspring, thus a mixed family in the true interspecific sense. And that this hybrid offspring could have been fertile in turn, meaning it could then give rise to another generation. There are genetic clues that make us suspect that this might have happened because there is a Neanderthal trace that we are trying to understand in the genome of current modern non-African sapiens. So there is a trace that perhaps remains in our genome of this possible ancient hybridization, a small hybridization that is thought to have lasted a short time, believed to be in the Middle East. This story, which is a bit morbid because it is a story of sexual pairings, immediately raises a series of questions because it seems, among other things, that it was asymmetric. And this is very strange, meaning always Neanderthal father and sapiens mother, because not the other way around, which raises a whole series of questions about the aesthetic tastes of sapiens females 40,000 years ago. Moreover, it generates terrible feelings of inadequacy in human males who have their women taken away from them for about 45,000 years. So it raises a whole series of open questions. So, jokes aside, this story poses an interesting question. That becomes an excellent educational tool because especially in high school and middle school, when the concept of species has already been established, it opens up a very interesting question. It has happened to me that students asked me this without me giving them a hint, meaning if they mated and produced hybrid offspring, then they were not two distinct species, because if they could mate and exchange genes, then there was no genetic barrier between the species. Great question, great question. We do not know how to answer this question. If it is true, if it is confirmed that they could mate and that the hybrid offspring were not sterile, it means that there was no crossing barrier between those two populations. It's true, so who knows? In our Homo sapiens exhibition, In Doubt, based on Guido Barbuiani's suggestion, who already sensed this whole debate, we didn't even call the last ones human species, but we called them human forms. In Uncertainty, we call them human forms because we do not know exactly how things are going. This choice to call them human forms, which is a very simple thing regarding the texts of an exhibition, however, makes you understand how one can, in a popular way, once again, convey and narrate an ongoing technical controversy. That is, one should not be afraid to tell what is really happening in science because, I repeat, controversy, debate, and the confrontation of alternative hypotheses is the best way to also convey the scientific content. That is, what this story, this great narrative of human evolution is teaching us. So what you see represented here is another story, a different way of telling a story. And the last point, then I will really stop, is another question that arises almost intuitively. And so you see that if we turn the story upside down, I will pause for a moment on a methodological aspect. We are making it intuitive, that is, we are making it understandable, even acceptable, and if you are good, exciting, a story that was in itself counterintuitive, that is a narrative technique, right? It is an alternative story. You play on the aspects of contingency, unpredictability, and surprise that exist in this story, and you make it intuitive, and it passes and destroys. That is, it makes you forget that old, pedagogically wrong, scientifically wrong image from which we started, that of the chain of progress. And so it happens to me that my university students come to tell me that they go home and annoy their parents because they don't understand that the way of telling human evolution is wrong. They become a nuisance. And the fundamental thing is the certain proof that the teaching, at least, of a philosopher of science works. I work in a biology department, and in my course on the philosophy of biological sciences, I work on deconstructing the models that they often took for granted. Then they go and annoy others in different courses, and it has already happened to me that they say, "What have you taught these kids that they have become full of doubts?" Well, I taught them science, which is the exercise of doubt, and therefore in questioning what is often taken for granted, trying to always see the open side of science. I was saying earlier, another question that comes up here is one that they often ask me, without being prompted. And in my opinion, this is an important clue. Why are there so many species? What is the need for that? What is the necessity of having so many species? Wasn't the previous story simpler? This is also a good question. It's an excellent question. The chimpanzees, gorillas, they separated from us because about 6 to 8 million years ago, and it seems they didn't have such a bushy history. They didn't produce so many species, yet they managed just fine. Is it mandatory to always have these highly branched species radiations? This is an interesting question because why have we had so many species? The answer involves climate, geography, and geographical location. Ours is probably a bush. This is a hypothesis we make today. It is a bush so rich in species because we are the ones who got stuck in the eastern part of Africa, thus an environment that became much more unstable. The tropical forest was gradually taken away from us, and the forest cover kept fragmenting more and more, while those who remained in the western part, all in all, stayed in an environment very similar to their original one. So perhaps the secret of this bush lies in the fact that these who are our ancestors are the ones who had to manage in an unstable environment, in an unstable ecology, which required adaptive experiments, such as bipedalism, which we have experienced, moreover, in diversified ways, in different ways. And so, from here you can start to tell another very beautiful idea, but now there is no time, which is mosaic evolution. This idea, which is very present in papers today, that evolution has proceeded through a sort of continued diversification, a mosaic. That is, the major innovations within this bush do not emerge all at once, and then all the others take them and acquire them. It is a differentiated discard evolution. Bipedalism, for example, did not just come out once. It seems to have emerged many times in different ways. This idea that evolution, now I am anthropomorphizing evolution, so I am making a mistake, but I do it for the sake of pedagogical indulgence, produces innovations by experimenting with many alternative solutions, not choosing one and moving forward on that, but experimenting with many alternative solutions. So it works through experimentation, diversification, which is this idea of mosaic evolution. Last thing, sometimes the kids notice right away when you make this comparison between models, the question marks. The question marks are fundamental. Here there are question marks. There is one under Florentians. There is one at a crucial point that is at the base of the genus Homo. There is one here. There is one between Ardipithecus and the Australopithecines. There is one here. There are many question marks. They are question marks placed at crucial points. For example, if I do a very simple exercise, I start from Homo sapiens, follow the solid lines, go back, and at a certain point I stop because there is that dashed line you see with the question mark. Then I make the jump, I resume my story, I go into the red lines, I go back with the red lines, and at a certain point I stop again, there is another question mark, and then again. So, this means that I cannot reconstruct today a continuous story of descendant ancestors that starts from Homo sapiens and reaches the common ancestor. I do not have the elements to do so. There are gaps, there are question marks. For example, today we do not know what it was, where it lived, who the common ancestor of the genus Homo was, which is quite a trivial matter because, for example, a few years ago many already took it for granted that we came from an Australopithecine to a Paranthropus, roughly a Lucy or a species subsequent to Lucy. Today, the debate has reopened. We are no longer sure about this. Why are we no longer sure? Because southern ostracods like Sediba have been discovered, very recent ones. In fact, Sediba lived, see that dot there to the left, over 2 million years ago, meaning it lived in very recent times. And there are some, naturally the discoverer of Sediba and the South African school, because there are also national rivalries, who think that the genus Homo may have emerged from there, that is, from the southern Australopithecines, and not from the northern eastern Australopithecines like Lucy. Thus a debate has reopened. In uncertainty, since we are not sure, a dashed line is drawn and a question mark is placed. We do not know where the Australopithecines came from, for example. Did they come from Ardipithecus? Perhaps. Some think so, but we are not sure. And so a question mark is placed. Why do I give you all these examples, which I always do with the kids? Because I want to point this out to the kids. We started from a simple, clear, persuasive model without question marks, which is wrong. We have arrived at a model that is much richer in information, where we know a lot more things, there are many more species, it is much more precise, it is much more realistic, and there are more question marks than before. And this is the last message I want to leave you with. It is something typical of the scientific method. In science, the question marks increase over time. They do not decrease. This may seem counterintuitive, but it always happens this way. Why? Because acquiring new information means refuting old ideas, learning new things, but automatically new scientific information generates new questions. In other words, they make you realize that you didn't know a lot of things. You realize that you were ignorant without even knowing you were ignorant, right? Who 20 years ago in school at a university in physics would have asked the question, but professor, why is it that over 90% of the matter, energy of the universe we have never seen, because it is dark energy and dark matter? 15 years ago, it was a meaningless question. It made no sense. New discoveries, new models have made us realize that we didn't know a lot of things. And so we discover, perhaps, I am not an expert, that so far we have studied only 4% of the universe, and that 96% completely eludes us. The unknown has opened up again before us. It has, once again, swung wide open before us. So the question marks have increased. And this is not a weakness of science. It is the strength of science. It generates new questions and makes you realize that you didn't know many things. This thing I just told you, I started with a quote from Darwin. I quote with a quote from the other side. That is Newton, the physical side. Newton once wrote in his old age, he wasn't a particularly nice guy, but sometimes he wrote very beautiful things. He responds to the question asked of him, but listen, Master, if you had to tell us what the scientific method consists of, what would you say? And Newton responded like this. He said, look, in my opinion, the scientific method is, I see it like this. It's a recurring dream. It's like a child walking on a beach. And what does he do? So a child, thus a metaphor for childhood, for very beautiful learning, a child who goes to the beach and starts observing the pebbles on the beach and is curious. He overlooks the pebbles that don't have a significant shape and begins to make analogies between those that have similar shapes and starts to draw connections between the shapes, seeing connections where others do not see them, and discovers something, discovers laws of nature, discovers rules, discovers underlying regularities in that apparent chaos he is observing. Newton says, this is the job I have done all my life, but he adds, the child, while walks on the beach and is doing this exercise, knows that beside him lies the vast ocean of the unknown, of what we still do not know. Here, this is one of the most beautiful metaphors of the scientific method. You learn new things. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know many others. This is an infinite endeavor, started a few centuries ago, and I hope it never ends, and that we will find a way to share it passionately with the next generations. Thank you.